The message came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting in my small apartment, staring at lines of code on my laptop screen. It was from my cousin Sarah. At first, I almost ignored it. My phone had been buzzing all week with random family messages I didn't have the energy to answer. But something about the wording made me pause. "Hey, are you okay?" I frowned. That was an unusual way for her to start a conversation. Before I could reply, another message popped up. "I heard you're in rehab. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here." For a moment, I just stared at the screen. Rehab, I blinked, wondering if I had misread the message. Maybe she meant someone else. Maybe it was a weird joke. But Sarah wasn't the kind of person who joked about something like that. My fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. "What are you talking about?" The typing bubble appeared almost instantly. "You don't have to hide it from me," she wrote. "Your mom told everyone at the family dinner last night. She said you checked yourself into a treatment center because things got really bad." The room suddenly felt smaller. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I was reading. A treatment center, things got really bad. My chest tightened as a slow, heavy realization settled in. My parents had told the entire family that I was in rehab. I wasn't even sure which part of the lie was worse, the fact that they invented it, or the fact that they had told it so confidently that everyone believed them. I immediately called Sarah. She answered on the second ring. "Hey," she said gently, her voice full of cautious concern. "How are you feeling? How am I feeling?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sarah, I'm sitting in my apartment working right now. I'm not in rehab." There was a long pause on the other end. "What?" I have no idea why my parents said that. I continued. "But it's not true." She sounded genuinely shocked. "But your mom was so serious about it. She said you'd been struggling for months, that you needed help." I let out a slow breath and rubbed my temples. Of course, she sounded serious. My mother had always been good at telling stories, especially the ones that made her look like the hero. "What exactly did she say?" I asked quietly. Sarah hesitated. "She told everyone you had a problem, that quitting your job messed you up, that you started making bad decisions, and she convinced you to go to rehab before things got worse." Each word felt like another stone being placed on my chest. Bad decisions, messed up, rehab. My parents hadn't just lied. They had completely rewritten my life. 18 months earlier, I had made the biggest decision of my life. I quit my corporate job. It was the kind of job my parents loved to brag about. Stable, respectable, safe, but I hated it. Every morning felt like walking into a life that didn't belong to me. The meetings, the spreadsheets, the endless conversations about profits and quarterly targets, it all felt hollow. And deep down, I knew I wanted something else, so I quit, not because I was reckless, not because I was lost, but because I had an idea for a company I believed in. My parents didn't see it that way. To them, leaving a perfectly good job to build an app from a tiny apartment sounded like the beginning of a personal disaster. At first, they tried to convince me I was making a mistake. Then they tried guilt, then anger. Eventually, when none of that worked, they stopped talking to me altogether. I thought the silence meant they had accepted my decision. I was wrong. Instead of understanding my choice, they had decided to create a different explanation. One that made them look less embarrassed. One that made my life sound like a tragedy instead of a risk. Sarah finally spoke again. "So you're really not in rehab?" I looked around my apartment, the chipped coffee table, the empty ramen cup sitting beside my laptop, the whiteboard covered in messy startup ideas. "No," I said quietly. "I'm just building something." When we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. I imagined my relatives sitting around the dinner table, listening to my mother tell the story. The worried looks, the sympathetic nods, the whispered conversations afterward. Poor Daniel, such a shame. I should have felt angry. Instead, something colder settled in my chest, a quiet, steady determination. If my parents wanted to tell stories about my life, then I would make sure the ending was something they could never control. Lies move fast in families, faster than truth. Within a few days, The story my parents created had already traveled through relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Aunts, uncles, distant cousins, even family friends suddenly remembered I existed, but not because they cared about me. Because they believed I had fallen apart. My phone began filling with messages. Your parents told us what you're going through. Stay strong. We're praying for your recovery. It takes courage to admit when you need help. Every notification felt like a quiet punch to the chest. I wanted to reply to all of them. I wanted to explain that I wasn't in rehab, that I wasn't broken, that nothing they had heard was real, but after typing and deleting several responses, I realized something. No one had asked me, not one person had called to hear my side of the story. They had simply accepted the version my parents gave them. So eventually, I stopped trying to correct it. If they wanted to believe the lie, I would let them. Because while they imagined me sitting in some treatment center, I was sitting in a freezing apartment, trying to keep my dream alive. The place wasn't much. A single room with old yellow walls and a heater that worked only when it felt like it. My desk was an old kitchen table I bought from a thrift store, and the chair wobbled every time I leaned back. But it was the only thing I could afford after quitting my job. Most days started the same way. I woke up early, made cheap coffee, and opened my laptop before the sun had fully risen. Emails, bug reports, server issues, design problems, there was always something that needed fixing. My company wasn't really a company yet. It was just me and one developer named Alex who lived thousands of miles away. We had met in an online forum months earlier. He liked the idea I was building and agreed to help develop the product in exchange for payment later, if the company ever succeeded. It wasn't exactly a stable business structure, but it was all I had. There were nights when exhaustion hit so hard that I fell asleep with my laptop still open beside me. Other nights I stayed awake until 3 or 4 in the morning, trying to solve problems that felt impossible. Sometimes I would pause and stare at the ceiling, wondering if my parents were right. Maybe I had been stupid. Maybe leaving my stable job had been reckless. Maybe I had thrown away the life I worked so hard to build. Those thoughts usually appeared around 2 in the morning, when the world was quiet and doubt grew louder. But then I would remember the story my parents told, the story where I wasn't brave, I wasn't ambitious. I wasn't chasing something bigger. In their version of my life, I had simply fallen apart, and that memory would push me back to my laptop. Because if there was one thing I couldn't accept, it was letting their version become reality. A few weeks after the rumor spread, Sarah called me again. I still don't understand why they said that, she told me. I think I do, I replied. Why? I looked around the apartment. The cheap furniture, the unpaid bills on the table, the startup dashboard on my screen showing numbers that were still painfully small. They're embarrassed, I said quietly. Embarrassed, think about it. I continued. Their son quit a good job to build a startup no one has heard of. It sounds irresponsible. Sarah was silent for a moment. So they told everyone you're in rehab instead. It's easier, I said. Easier than what? Admitting I chose a path they don't understand. Later that night, after we hung up, I opened the analytics dashboard for the app I had spent months building. The numbers were small, 30, 7 active users. It wasn't impressive. Most people would probably call it a failure. But those 37 people were real users, real strangers who had downloaded something I created. And for the first time in weeks, a small smile appeared on my face, because rock bottom isn't always what people think it is. Sometimes rock bottom is where everyone believes you've already lost, where no one expects anything from you, where the world assumes your story is already finished. But the funny thing about rock bottom is that it's also the only place left to build from. And I had just started building. 18 months passed before anything truly changed, not overnight. Not with a sudden breakthrough, just slow, painful progress, the kind that almost feels invisible while it's happening. In the beginning, my app had 37 users. A month later, it had 50, then 80, then 120. None of those numbers were impressive enough to brag about, but each new user felt like a tiny vote of confidence from the universe. Someone out there believed the idea mattered, even if my own family didn't. Life during those 18 months became a blur of long days and longer nights. I stopped paying attention to weekends. Holidays passed quietly without much celebration. While everyone else was moving forward with promotions, weddings, and vacations, I was sitting in the same small apartment trying to solve problems that never seemed to end. Money was always tight. There were months when I seriously wondered if I would have to shut everything down and go back to a normal job. But somehow, every time things felt like they were about to collapse, something small would happen that kept the company alive. A new customer, a helpful email from a user, a feature request that showed someone truly cared about the product. Slowly, the numbers began to grow. By the end of the first year, we had crossed 10,000 users. That was the moment when things started to feel real. Alex and I celebrated over a late-night video call. Neither of us had slept much that week, but we were smiling like two kids who had just discovered a hidden treasure. "This is only the beginning," Alex said. I wanted to believe him, but I had learned to be careful with hope. Startups are fragile things. One bad decision, one unexpected problem, and everything can disappear overnight. So instead of celebrating too much, I went back to work. The second year moved faster, growth picked up. Strangers began mentioning our product in online forums. A few tech blogs wrote small posts about the app. Nothing huge, but enough to make the internet notice. Still, I never imagined that anyone truly important was paying attention. Which is why the phone call caught me completely off guard. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was deep in the middle of fixing a server issue that had been bothering me for hours. My desk was covered with empty coffee cups, and my eyes burned from staring at the screen for too long. My phone vibrated beside the keyboard. Unknown number. Normally, I ignored those calls. Most of them were spam anyway. But for some reason, I answered this one. "Hello, hi, is this Daniel?" The voice on the other end sounded professional. "Yes, speaking. Hi, Daniel, my name is Rebecca. I'm a journalist from Forbes." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. "Sorry, from where? Forbes?" She repeated politely. "We're working on a feature about emerging startup founders, and your company came up several times during our research." My brain struggled to process the words. Forbes, the magazine I used to flip through during airport layovers back when I still had my corporate job. The same magazine that featured billionaires, CEO, and famous entrepreneurs. And now someone from there was calling me. "I think you might have the wrong person," I said. She laughed softly. "No, I'm pretty sure I have the right one. Your product has been gaining serious traction over the past 6 months. Investors and founders have started talking about it." I leaned back in my chair, stunned. While I had been busy fighting small daily battles, something bigger had apparently been happening behind the scenes. People were noticing. "We'd love to interview you for the article," Rebecca continued. "Your story is really interesting." "My story?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "The journey of building a startup from scratch without outside funding. It's inspiring. Inspiring." The word felt strange. For almost 2 years, my life had felt anything but inspiring. It had felt exhausting. Uncertain, lonely, but suddenly, someone from the outside was looking at the same struggle and seeing something different. Opportunity, success, potential. After we finished the call, I placed my phone slowly back on the table. The apartment was completely silent. I looked around the room that had been my entire world for the past 2 years. The scratched table, the messy whiteboard full of ideas, the old laptop that had survived countless sleepless nights. And for the first time, a strange realization settled in my mind. If Forbes was calling me, then sooner or later, everyone else would hear about it too, including the people who had once told the whole family that I was in rehab. The interview with the journalist from Forbes happened 2 weeks later. At first, I was nervous, not because I didn't know my story, but because I had spent so long living quietly that the idea of strangers reading about my life felt surreal. For nearly 2 years, the only people who knew about my struggles were Alex, a few loyal users, and the empty walls of my apartment. Now someone wanted to write about it. The interview lasted almost an hour. Rebecca asked about everything. Why I quit my corporate job, what the first months of building the startup were like, how I survived when the company had almost no money. She asked about the nights of doubt, the small wins, the moments when I nearly gave up. At one point she paused and asked, "Did people support your decision in the beginning?" I hesitated. For a second I thought about telling her the truth about my parents and the rehab rumor, but something stopped me. Instead, I simply said, "Not everyone understood it." She seemed to understand exactly what that meant. When the call ended, life returned to normal, at least for a few days. I went back to fixing bugs, responding to emails, and planning the next version of the product. Part of me even wondered if the article would actually happen. Media projects get cancelled all the time. Maybe nothing would come from it, but early one Tuesday morning, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating nonstop on the table beside my bed. Half asleep, I reached over and looked at the screen. There were dozens of notifications, messages, emails, missed calls. For a moment I thought something had gone wrong with the company's servers, but then I saw the first message. "Daniel, I just saw the article. Another one appeared. This is incredible. Congratulations." Then another. "You're on Forbes." My heart started beating faster. I opened my email and saw the link that several people had already sent me. The headline sat at the top of the page, "From unknown founder to rising star, how Daniel built one of the fastest growing startups this year." For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen. My name, my story, published for the world to see. The article talked about the long nights, the early struggles, and how the product had quietly grown into a platform used by thousands of people. Reading it felt strange, because while the article made the journey sound impressive, I still remembered the exhaustion, the doubt, and the loneliness behind every step. But the outside world didn't see those details. They saw success. Within an hour, my phone felt like it might explode. Old coworkers were calling. Industry founders were sending congratulations. Even investors began reaching out. And then Sarah called. I answered immediately. She didn't even say hello. "Okay," she said, half laughing and half shocked. "You will not believe what just happened here." "What?" "My mom just sent the article to the family group chat." I raised an eyebrow. "That was fast." "No, wait," Sarah continued. "It gets better." "What do you mean?" "My parents said your dad just opened his email and saw like 10 messages from relatives asking if you're the same Daniel from the article." I couldn't help smiling slightly. And everyone is confused," she said, "because according to your parents, you were supposed to be in rehab." For the first time since the rumor started, the irony of the situation hit me fully. The story my parents created had worked for almost 2 years. Everyone believed it, until the truth arrived publicly. Through Forbes, Sarah lowered her voice slightly. "I think they're panicking." "Why?" "Because the entire family is now asking questions." Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time, the name on the screen made me freeze. Mom. I hadn't spoken to her in months. For a moment, I considered letting the call go unanswered. But I didn't. I picked up. There was a brief silence on the line. Then she spoke. "We saw the article." Her voice sounded different than I remembered. "Quieter. We're proud of you," she added. I didn't reply immediately, not because I was angry, but because something inside me had already moved past the need for validation. After everything that happened, the success didn't feel like revenge. It felt like closure, because the sweetest kind of revenge isn't arguing with people who doubted you. It's quietly building a life so undeniable that the truth eventually introduces itself.